Hello, everyone, and welcome back to episode 4 of the Just an Excuse podcast, where the name is the game and the game is D&D, and it's all the characters in between. Although, as you're about to find out, I do branch out every once in a while to a different system. I am your host and the one with the perpetual need for an excuse and any reason to discuss his relative insanity. My name is Miguel Bloomberg, and I'm very happy to have you back at my table. With me today is a very special guest, and an episode I have been dying to make ever since I came up with this little idea. Now, fun fact, this whole excuse thing was just a ruse to get this one individual sitting at my proverbial table so that I can avail myself of all things in his mind. That would be my very good friend, player, and for the purposes of this episode, DM of one of my favorite running campaigns at the moment. That'd be my good friend of Mice and Men, or as we just call him, Fen. How you doing, Fen?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
All right. So, last couple of episodes you have heard, I think except for episodes 1 and 2, if you are up to date with your Just an Excuse watching series, have both been set in one campaign. That would be the stories of Zamir and Adia, both our PCs, in the campaign that is currently being headed and run by the individual that is gracing your ears right now. And I'm very happy to have him because this particular episode won't be about characters specifically. Not one character, it's more just all of the other characters at once and the character of a setting. This will be an episode specifically about campaigns. We'll be discussing the campaign. You know, this is a good question I should have asked Fen before we started recording, but we're here now, so we're going to roll with it. Fen, what is the name of this campaign?
I have been referring to it as the title of the section on Discord, which is Ashes of Empire.
Ashes of Empire. The Ashes of Empire campaign. I didn't want to guess, but I did make the posters with that title on it, so I kind of hoped that was correct.
You can't walk back from that. That's done. It's branding. It's over.
It's on my wall. It's too late now. So either way, we're going to talk about one of my favorite current fantasy and D&D settings. That would be the setting of the oh man, Sven, you wouldn't happen to have a name of a continent, would you?
Would you know? I don't.
Well, then for now, we'll just call this a little dose of a fantasy setting I love very much, and that would be the Ashes of Empire campaign.
Coming out here was a mistake. In the end, the crew turned on each other. We were all greedy and foolish. We stumble through a godless world, and all the while the few remain slumber beneath our feet. We are but roaches atop their shoulders, daring to dive deeper into their slumbering graves. My death here is meaningless, for while my body may one day stand as an omen on this debaucherous path, I have no doubt that humanity will, in all its great and terrible foolishness, not heed these words.
Tomb Cadaver, from the Archive of Recovered and Uncredited Texts, Volume 3, The Godgraves, property of the Ishtek Grand Library. A figure descends down a rope into the depths of a forgotten chamber. Finding this place had been difficult. Keeping it a secret had been even harder. The last thing he needed was competition for his rightful take. That's why only his brother and their guide knew, both of whom now watched from the chamber's edge above, silhouetted against the light. His boots touch down softly on dust-covered stone. He glances up through the sunlight streaming into the chamber for the first time in centuries. They motion for him to continue. He rolls his eyes. Taking a moment to adjust to the dimness, he moves forward, steps stirring up the remnants of a long-buried past. The chamber, once fit for a king, is now little more than a ruin, weathered and crumbling, half swallowed by the earth.
He pays no mind. His focus is ahead, on the staircase at the chamber's heart. At the top stands a statue, its features long erased by time, but in its outstretched hands a spear, gold and ivory, gleaming as if untouched by the centuries. He grins and pulls it free with a careless tug. The weight of the gold is satisfying. He gives it an uncoordinated spin, enjoying the feel of it in his grasp. What he doesn't notice is the balance, perfect, precise, and deliberate. Some things are not meant to be taken.
Yeah, it's risky. These ain't the Varian folk we're fixing here. No sense of fair play. Makes them unpredictable. Not like some knife-eared hoof couldn't afford to lose a little pocket change. Hell, I doubt they'd even notice if they did. But upside's good. Good. All I'm saying is, if they're willing to make that little shit Ravel a senator, then who knows what this'll make me.
Page from a gunslinger's journal, from the Archive of Recovered and Uncredited Texts, Volume 7, Tavar, property of the Ishtek Grand Library. The sun hung high, casting hard shadows over the dusty street. Two men stood opposed, motionless. From shaded porches and narrow balconies, the town watched in silence. The duelists lock eyes. Fingers hover near holsters, twitching with anticipation. A child pushes forward, squeezing between legs, slipping past shoulders. She had missed last week's duel. She wouldn't miss this one. Outsiders never understood how a place so lawless could draw so many. How a town of liars, cheats, gamblers, and grave robbers could call itself a community. But they didn't get it. Yes, everyone here would cheat and steal, but here, there was no doubt. In this world where the gods seemed distant, men had to take their place. In such a world, why should it be more noble for a faceless king to slaughter thousands to claim his throne, than for a gunslinger to shoot one man to claim his glory? Why should a robber be judged for taking his prize in the open, rather than behind the walls of a palace? But the people of Tavar watched, day after day, was ordinary men staking their claim on greatness. Finally, the little girl stumbled to the front, breathless, eyes wide. Today she would see it. Today all of Tavar would witness the birth of their own gods.
To be hunted, feed or be fed upon. I shall not fear, I shall not weep, for my prey would not for me.
Recovered Weapon Inscription, from the Archive of Recovered and Uncredited Texts, Volume 2, Samira Khan, property of the Ishtek Grand Library. Silent as a shadow, a lone figure moves through the tall grass, the movement of the foliage that parts around him indistinguishable from a low breeze. The vast grassland seems to stretch all around him, golden in the light. Each step is careful and deliberate, no rustling, no sound. Eventually, he reaches a clearing and gently parts the grass. There, beneath the twisted branches of an acacia tree, a great horned cat lays curled, its chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. It was easy to track, and what the hunter suspected was a full belly was sure to be its downfall. Full prey often got lazy. It was all easy. And disappointing. With practiced ease, he drew an arrow from the quiver. There had once been a pageantry to this, a culture. Young men used to take pride in it. A hunter might grow old, but competition always kept him sharp. The hunter missed those days. There were so few hunters now. The Khan had seen to that. No more room for thrill. Hunger and responsibility were the only things that kept him sharp now. Knocking his arrow, the hunter drew the string taut. He took a moment to steady his aim, the bowstring creaking under the strain. Then the beast's ear twitched. In an instant, its golden eyes snapped open, and the predator locked eyes with predator. The hunter, suddenly grateful for the familiar weight of the hunting knife strapped to his bandolier, couldn't suppress a toothy grin. He finally had his hunt.
There are hundreds of small settlements between here and the Khan homeland. Most were abandoned at the mere thought of a Khan invasion. Well-founded fears, frankly. Most of the refugees we can expect have already begun to flee south, and we can expect those numbers in the thousands. What few towns had been slow to vacate have been captured instead of ransacked, not the usual Khan custom. They may have anticipated our aid, but they were wrong. They're now trapped.
Excerpt from the report on Khan occupation progress to the Sharif of Marakir, from the Sharif of Marishtek's personal collection. Khan territory was always dangerous, even if you were on their side. Might made right here, and if there weren't enemies to prove it, then allies would have to do. All this made a spy's work particularly difficult. Tonight, it made it deadly. A hooded figure pressed against stone. The gnolls were back, right on time. She counted her heartbeats as they lumbered past. She was just shy of 12 before their light disappeared. She gestured toward the alley across from her. One by one, the refugees started pouring across. Volunteering to be a packed spy had been a personal choice, one she made months before the invasion started. When she was finally assigned, she was given a new name, a partner, and tasked with gathering information near Khan territory. It had come to her instead. She should have stuck to information gathering, but she knew what it meant to be trapped, and she wouldn't abandon these people. 2 patrols later, and the job was done. There were 50 in total, human, Thrycreen, even young gnolls. Their eyes flickered between one another, then to her, then to the dark expanse ahead. Behind them, the wild stretched out towards a quiet, starlit horizon. This was as far as she could take them. South lay the pack cities, crowded and uncertain. West, Tavar, lawless, but beyond the Khan's reach, for now. Whatever path they chose, it would be theirs alone. Still they hesitated. She could see it in their shifting feet, their shallow breaths. For all its danger, this place had guides, a path to follow. Out there would be none. Then, as if given a silent command, they moved. Some with purpose, others with doubt, but all vanishing into the night like shadows before the dawn. Only then did she retreat, slipping across the street just as the gnolls rounded the corner once more. She sent up a prayer to the burning god before disappearing back into town. By decree of the great Khan, Khan Tar of the Red Grin, for their crimes against the great Khan, any and all members of the Fixum Finis Crafting Company are to be considered criminals and enemies of the Khan. Any affiliation with the company will be considered an act of aggression and will be met with swift retribution. Khan Bounty Poster. Arkala.
Okay, well, that was a good time. I sure hope that lived up to expectations. But for now, we're just going to get into the nitty-gritty of this little episode here. So, Fen, very excited to have you. Gotta start off with a very basic question. Where did the inspiration for this campaign come from, right? Was it... I know I have brainstormed characters in session settings before, and it's always kind of come from, usually, they don't spring fully formed into my head at a time. They're usually like a nugget of an idea. There's a vibe, or there's a song I hear, or I heard an idea somewhere and I thought I could do it better, and that results in something. Where was the seed of this campaign idea? Where did this place come from?
Of all the questions, that's the one I was most, anticipated you asking, and it's the one I could not formulate an answer to prior. I think perhaps it's only my style, but somewhat differently from making a character when I make a setting. Like, different regions might have different inspirations, but that's a dissatisfying answer, so I'll give you an answer, which I will warn you may not be the answer. But in my opinion, there are two main ways to write a story. The first is your situation in which things are good, and then there's this kind of outward darkness that threatens that goodness. Heroes rise, fight that darkness, return to the status quo. That's everything from Mario, Bowser kidnapping the princess and getting her back, to your Hobbitville in Lord of the Rings being threatened and then destroying the ring. There's these stories of good, threat, and then back to good. Mm-hmm. And then there's a second way of writing, right, in which you have a situation where things are just bad off the start. You're opening up in your, unfortunate situation. And then it's from that unfortunate situation that goodness rises and changes the overall status quo to something better. That's more like your dystopian, like your Hunger Games and such. Both are good ways to do it, but for me, I'm more interested in the second of the two. And Ashes was designed to facilitate that type of story, I think.
So a story, if I'm understanding correctly, a story where things are already, rather than going from good to bad to back to good, rather a start out of evil. If I'm hearing that right? I don't want to paraphrase.
Yeah, it's great paraphrasing. It's the exogenous shock. Instead of being this thing that challenges the world and the heroes raise, the exogenous shock is the heroes. They show up seemingly out of nowhere, and then what effect they have on their world is their own.
So it becomes a story of, rather than in the first example, the heroes are bringing the world back to a state, they're physically pushing the world to a different state, because the status quo was awful. The status quo was evil, and the characters now have a chance to, rather than just bring the world back to peace, actually create it. That's how I'm interpreting it.
Indeed, it makes forces the heroes to be proactive rather than reactive. It's not as easy as just stopping, Mount Doom or, Voldemort or Bowser. Yeah, you have to, it tends to be kind of bigger issues. And that sort of story interested me when I was creating the setting. I hope it's interesting you all, now that you're enduring it.
No, it's been very interesting thus far. That takes me into, I might be jumping the gun a little bit, but I want to ask this question because it's such a perfect lead-in. Obviously I don't want to say obviously, it's your setting, so I'm not going to assume anything. But for me, in the very few times I've DM'd, I've obviously created a grand continent, and there have been factions and all these things. But in reality, most D&D campaigns, if you're lucky, and they go as long as they can go, which ours have gone on for a very long time, they stay within a certain region. So there is a kind of natural lockout to a lot of stories that maybe could have been told just due to the fact that they're not there, right? So, like, we couldn't do a swashbuckling sea pirate adventure because we're in a desert, to put it in a more upfront terms. Was there did you make this world and then you sat down with the setting and you said, man, if I had to write a book with this setting, the story would be about X, Y, and Z. But then obviously you opened the campaign up to us morons, and we have taken it the way it's gone. What did that story that the morons came up with, did that deviate really far from where you wanted? Did it kind of wind up where you were okay with it? Or did you have no idea where it was going to go at all? Like, what was the story you wanted to tell with this campaign in general?
So I have two answers. The first answer is a bit of a reveal. I'm not sure if I've ever mentioned this, but when I first opened up the campaign and I was first setting everything up, the story was supposed to start in Tavar. That was supposed to be the primary setting. Yeah, you may notice. Yeah, you may notice that the region in which the majority of the campaign has taken place is not on my initial map. Hence, it not necessarily being the place I expected to start. But as we started and I got the characters, and I started seeing kind of where everyone was looking, I started to change my perspective. And I also kind of wanted to tell a story set in kind of the place where you don't set campaigns, like the natural place to be would be in any of these like major, cities with these major people, but to start somewhere that was really like a backwater that was not very developed. Yeah, the place that wasn't even really making it on the maps at the region lets you tell a story where you could kind of come up from nothing much faster and kind of be punching at a higher weight fairly early. You didn't have to deal with these huge entrenched powers. It was really a blank slate with which to do something.
Yeah. And I think it also felt more natural, the sort of coming up of these heroes, because they obviously, they met at the backwater, and that allowed them to, I don't know, it feels more natural. Like, they started small time, and then they obviously grew from there, rather than just being in the city and becoming big time. So I think that's pretty cool. You say you had a second half to that answer.
That was both in terms of the overall plot going where I expected it to. Before I had the characters, I had no clue where we were going. Once I had the characters, there was kind of a trajectory that I could see, and vaguely things have followed that trajectory. The individual details, I don't see coming. I definitely don't have plot points ahead of time, but I do have a good wide arc of where things are going to go. And it's been more or less in line with that. Kind of because I feel like when you write a character and you give it to someone, a lot of times there's a natural ending.
Right, yeah.
And so once you know the beginning and you know the ending, it's just kind of getting there.
Yeah, it's kind of about like connecting the dots at that point. And then obviously the journey is what makes it all the more impactful, but you can still kind of pin down where it's gonna hopefully wind up. Would you say that the some of those finer details really were affected by character story? Like, obviously, if there was a region you hadn't considered and then the character has a reason to be at a different region, has that, in the past of this story, changed the way you've planned things to go? Like, did you ever have to move things around to kind of make them fit in a better way? Like, how much did the characters, when you sat down and read their backstories, how much did that influence the direction of the story?
You all are playing a crafting company whose goal is to craft stuff. That was not my original frame goal.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
The story has been completely driven by kind of the individual character story that make up the story. This may seem odd, I don't want to come across the wrong way, but I am more invested in each of the characters' story than I don't have an overall world story. And that might be somewhat dissatisfying because a lot of times you have a story and there's this big like threat to the world and then it's overcome and you have a clear beginning and a clear ending. The clear beginning and ending is these characters. The kind of downside to that is I don't really foresee like truly like change, like reshaping the world fundamentally eternally. It's about changing the world, but it's more so about the characters. It's not really about this big national, international, global plot development that I have.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah.
So you would say it's a solidly character-driven narrative.
In spite of the fact that it seems like it's not, genuinely, yes. If you all had like made characters that all could have gone about your entire story in one city, I'd have run that. Honestly, in hindsight, one of my regrets about Ashes is how big it is. The setting, I would have cut 50 to 75% of it off at minimum.
Really? Do you
Could
mean
I
just
do it
like
again?
like pure geography, or just how much is per the like when you say 50-60%? Do you mean like cut off the rest of the map and just have it be focused on the region we're in, or do you mean like entirely, like if even it was just the region we're in right now, you would remove 50 to 60% of it?
Probably both. This is the last setting I made that was this big. When I make them in the future and when I make them currently, I focus on much smaller regions because it lets me get much more intimate with the details, and I can genuinely know what every town's like, what every like region is like. I can know it, and the players get to know it and get to understand it and kind of understand how they are. It's kind of odd, but the smaller you make a world, the more someone can say, "Oh, I want to go to this town," and I know what's in that town. Meanwhile, when you make such a large map, the players say, "Oh, I want to go this way," and you're like, "Well, like I have no clue what's there."
Something might be that direction. Fuck if I know. Just gotta go find it.
Yeah, because as we've gone through the story, kind of cities have kind of, I'm not gonna say they've appeared. They've always kind of been there in my head, but I wasn't so much like I didn't know if they were going to be relevant. And in a smaller region, you kind of assume everything's going to be relevant.
Yeah, right. That makes sense. Wow, I wouldn't have said that. I wouldn't have guessed that on the outset, because I think, like you mentioned, it feels, and this isn't a judgment. This is just an observation, because I've enjoyed this story immensely. Like, there's a reason I'm still here, and you've done an excellent job fostering that story. It feels that even from the beginning, we were. Well, you know what? Now that you say it, I feel like my opinion has changed a little bit. So I'll rephrase it. It felt like in the beginning we were very much small players, if we were players at all. And because of that, we were very much subject to just the reality of where the world was at the time. Like, the Khan was pushing down, and we had to go down, right? We had to get away from that fight. Even though along the way, we still kind of screwed them over just because we could, and that was all we could do at the time. But then we got to the major cities, and then we were kind of just messing around there, and then very early on we started getting those visions, which was like, there's horrible shit that's going to happen, and then we started, in our small way, stopping that from happening. That's where most of, I think the entire arc of Sitek was a result of just, we had a vision, and we had to stop it. And then after Sitek, especially, we really got our footing as like a player in the realm, it felt like. And then from there, it became less of us subject to the whims of the world, but more us pushing back against it. You know what I mean? Like we were forced to do certain things just because of where the world was. That's when it felt like it was kind of world story driven. But then as we began to become more important and more of a foothold as a company, we began to push back. We started carving out our own territory. We started pushing against the Khan at the wall, and now we're pushing against them at a different arc. Or I don't know if that counts as them. That's the Slaver King. But it's fascinating to hear that it's not major plot driven, considering it felt that way. But I think what's happened is it maybe just was the result of that's just where the world was, but we've then grown into a character-driven plot very focusedly, if that makes sense.
My general preferred narrative is to start with something that isn't character focused to get, like, so people know each other, so they have ground to stand on, so they kind of understand where the world is, and then you start leading it into more character driven stuff. That being said, I would like to note that I had no expectation for you all to go to Satek. That was Kepri doing divination and deciding that was where you all should go. I fully expected the city to fall and things to be kind of worse for you all. For the record, that was I never knew that arc was coming beforehand.
Really?
You all
Okay.
said, we're going to go stop that, and you sure did.
So the vision was that just you being like, hey, the city's gonna fall? Like, you didn't
Well-
expect us to actually go, like, pick up the phone?
This might be a bigger reveal. This might be more of a question than you realize. My style of DMing, I tend to kind of just do kind of how I think the world would be. So if you all, like, try to find the biggest problem, I will tell you all what the biggest problem is, whether or not I expect you all or want you all to go there. I'm not trying to bait you into a plot or out of one. A lot of the times, I just kind of make things the way that I feel like they are. That was one of those circumstances, and you all decided to deal with it, and so you all did.
Interesting. Okay. Taking a brief step back here, I wonder if, obviously I'm asking you to summarize a lot of information very fast. I wonder if we can kind of paint a picture for, or if maybe you could give us the elevator pitch for the campaign. Like, what was the, I don't know, if you had to give an elevator pitch for the campaign, what would it be? I'd love to kind of set a little bit of a scene, because I've always said it kind of had a, it was fantasy, but it was more kind of that Middle Eastern fantasy in the setting and the flavor, and I really enjoyed that as a very fresh breath of air. But I would love to hear it from straight from the horse's mouth.
Probably some ungodly mix of fantasy, but also dystopia, but also post-apocalyptic, but also some Middle East influences, but there's also the Wild West there. It's Bronze Age, post-apocalyptic. It really, I kind of hit both sides of the spectrum fairly wildly. Yeah.
Okay.
The idea of kind of high tech but low culture, I suppose, being I think that's a kind of setting description. The fact that you have this inspirations were RimWorld and Adventure Time. So
okay.
do with that what you will.
No, I think that's pretty good. Okay. Ooh, interesting. Okay. One last question on the topic of grander narrative, just a comment, if that could turn into a question, I don't know. When I first read the setting details for the campaign when I was creating the character, it felt like my personal, it's so crazy to me to learn that you did not have a larger plot, because from when I read it, I would have guessed like 100 to 1 that you had a larger plot in mind, because you had this setup with the King of Ashes, if I'm remembering his name right, who was like this previous ruler, and he ruled over, I think, like almost all of the area. I'm going to butcher your lore here, I'm sorry, correct me afterwards. He ruled over like most of the area, but then he like was like necromancer or something, and he had this great power, and then he eventually was overthrown and taken over, and as such his empire like disappeared overnight or something like that. I would have been willing to bet that the campaign would have had in some way to do with that guy coming back, or like discovering the secrets of his empire. Like maybe that's just my interpretation of reading what you gave us, but I would have guessed hands down that would have been something you were looking to do. And unfortunately, rather than chasing down a grand narrative or uncovering secrets of a lost civilization, we made a crafting company. So I thought for sure we were swiveling hard off of what your ideas were going to be. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That kind of comes from my position as an author. I'm not really an author, a creator of literature. a guy who says stuff to 4 to 5 other people, sometimes 6 other people, in a voice call at 6 o'clock at night. I grew up mostly reading nonfiction instead of fiction. That's just a lot of what I read when I was younger. And so I don't really follow the grand narrative. There's a concept of Chekhov's gun, like
Right.
everything gets used in the end. The plot's resolved. It's kind of this beautiful, like tight-knit way to do it. That could not be farther from the truth to me. If there's a gun, it's just going to sit there. Like it might get used, but it also might not. I create a world, I create details, and they're just kind of there. I just create things, and then my goal is following y'all's story through it. If you all had tied your character to that, great king and wanted to deal with that, cool. If you wanted to be archaeologists and your whole goal was to like paint together, what happened in the world, cool. But instead, we made a crafting company, and that's cool too. Like it's all the same to me.
Wow. All right. Well, your DMing style is very compelling. I really appreciate the way it feels that we're, like I've said in the past, that we're really the kind of sandbox nature almost. It's irony. We live in it. Our continent is a desert, but the way that it really feels like more than any other campaign I played in, and perhaps it's just me, I haven't played in a whole lot of campaigns. The way it feels like I feel really like the company has actually burgeoned into something. Like normally you're just a party and you are just, you're just a name. Maybe you defeat the bad guy at the end and you become, legendary heroes, but you don't become like, I'll use the example of Vox Machina. Vox Machina, they obviously became very famous heroes afterwards, but they eventually, if you fast forward 200-300 years, Vox Machina might be a name that lives on in legend, right? But it's not like they persisted beyond their years, right? They fell apart, not in the sense that they fell out, but they, heroes die and they pass on, they become myth and legend. And there's a kind of immaterial nature to that, right? Like it's fleeting. Like that's just the nature of heroes. That makes them feel really like not, I don't know, built in, burnt in. I'm struggling to really put to words what I'm trying to describe here, so I'm going to kind of fumble my way through the end of this comment. But in our campaign, it feels like the Fix Symphony's crafting company isn't just an adventuring party. It feels like it's actually becoming something that like 200-300 years into the future will still exist, will still be a force in the world. Maybe it becomes a tyrant thing. God knows what Craftworm's going to do with it. He's probably going to outlive all of us if he's lucky, given his draconic heritage. But it feels really cool to have, like, even if my character died next session, I can still feel like it's not like I'm just a member of the adventuring party that will never get. Maybe if they're lucky, I'll get a statue. But it feels like the company that they built really will persist beyond them. And that's a really cool feeling. I don't know if you did that on purpose or not, but it's a really fun feeling as a player to be like, if we ever came back to, like, if the Ashes of Empire Season 1 ended with everyone walking off into the sunset, and we were like, hey, what if we did it again? And we did Campaign 2 in the same setting, only 400 years in the future, I feel really confident that the Fix Symphony's crafting company will still be there. Do you feel the same way? I don't know if you did this on purpose, but I love the way that feels.
It's the goal, kind of, and I'm glad to hear it's working, was to kind of ironically hit both extremes. You have a setting where you're not playing in like where the world is new, you're playing in a place where the world's very old, and pretty much every region is already touched. Yeah, it's already touched by like ruins and stuff. There's ruins everywhere. There's all this history, and all these people have been doing all these things. And so on one hand, it's kind of easy to feel small because you haven't done any of that. But also, it kind of creates an openness to where, you all could create this and it could continue. And it seems like you all have, you create something that lasts the span of time and really like gets into the world and affects it. But again, that was all of your volitions. If you all had not wanted to do so, you could have, just kind of sat around, made money, and nothing else. But I think the story I'll leave the players wanted to tell was one of that deep change. I did create a setting specific so that you could, but I couldn't make you do it. That was, I think, no small part of you all.
Kind of playing off of that idea of a campaign too. If you wanted to tell another story in this setting, be that 500 years in the future or at the same time as this one, just adjacent on the other side of the continent, who knows, what would be some elements that you would really be excited to kind of touch on and play with? I'm not saying you would run a grand narrative, because you've said several times that that's not how you create and how you DM. But if there were like elements to the world that maybe hasn't been explored as strongly as they have been in this campaign, that could be explored in another campaign, what would those be? Like, is there a region that you would really be jonesing to talk about and run that maybe we aren't headed to in the trajectory of this campaign you'd love to look at? Like, talk to me about that a little bit.
Well, I have two answers. First answer, I will do that often, apparently. I don't think there's many regions I wouldn't want to tell a story. It would just be a different story. I'd want, again, as I mentioned earlier, to cut it into something smaller, but I'd take any sub-region and, I think I could flesh it out and tell an interesting story. Would I love to tell a cowboy story? Yes. Yes, I would. Would I love to tell, like, a story in the steppe that's more, like, working with that sort of, like, steppe theology and that sort of, more nomadic vibe? Yes, I would. I think it would all interest me. There's also this region that I've pseudo-referenced a couple of times, the kind of goblinoid, China-inspired region of Voxon. I actually kind of half wrote up that as a campaign setting. And then I looked at it and said, I probably should not run this, then put it back, unfortunately.
Entire goblin campaign.
Yeah, well, there's elves there, too.
Okay.
If it makes you feel any better. They're not playable, though. So
just imagine an entire PC party of just goblins.
Yeah, it's about where we'd be. But the kind of other answer is, I really think, and this probably is a bad thing to say, you might not like this answer, so my apologies. I think this campaign setting needs to cook one more time. I made this years ago. There's a lot of good in it. I'm really glad to be running it. But there's also, it was 3 years ago at this point when I made it. There's a lot of old stuff in it that I kind of, I wish I'd have done this differently, or I wish, I could add this, kind of piles up after a little bit, from my perspective. So as much as I'm enjoying running it. I have other ideas, plus I love deserts. Deserts are cool. But 3 years of deserts making me kind of want to run in a non-desert setting. Kind of just, there's other vibes, like Fae. I kind of don't have Fae in this setting, and there's aspects I would like to touch on, maybe a little bit less demons.
I think it's a testament to the world building that you're saying you want to lean more into the Fae angle, and I no issue with that. I think that's totally an interesting angle to go on. But I would come behind it and say that it doesn't feel like the reason of a lack of Fae is undiegetic, if that makes sense, right? You've really pitched the upper level of like fantasy and magic and like magical beings as like something that has evolved to be above the everyday, if that makes sense, right? Like the elves, which are like the closest thing to Fae that we currently have, despite the irony that they are like maintained by a falsehood, right? They're not actually immortal. They drink the fucking elixir every once in a while to maintain it, which is really cool. But they live in their separate little area, and they're basically closed off from the world, and they're basically just this isolationist, we're gonna outlive you anyway, we don't care, right? Like, it makes sense in that setting. And it's kind of a similar way to the way you've pitched godhood a little bit in the setting. Like, obviously there's the celestial gods, but we've been a lot more in tune with at least in this campaign, the more elemental gods. And they have felt very aloof and hands-off, maybe in tandem because they are less of a conscious deity, but more just embodiments of natural forces. You're talking about a lack of fae and playing more into it, which I would love to do. But I'm also standing around and saying, hey, it's not like I'm looking left and right going, where are all the elves? I'm going like, oh, they're not here because of this reason. Like, you've set it up in a way that makes sense, at least to me. So kudos to you. So, but to circle back around to saying you'd want to let it cook a little bit, and I might be kind of teasing the idea that I would love to do it, and I would. I'd imagine a lot of other players would too. If this campaign finishes and you put it on ice, say, hey guys, I'm going to let this setting cook for a little bit, and then we go, okay, fine. We come back and you go, hey, what if we did a campaign too? Would that be something you're like genuinely interested in doing, or would it be like you'd let it? Like, how are the changes you would make such load-bearing changes that you don't think you could relaunch the campaign 500 years in the future, or would it just have to be a completely like clean slate if you did?
You're I don't think you're gonna like this answer. I was trying to dance around it, but if you want me to rip off the band-aid, here I go. Maybe not every campaign setting. Some campaign settings are kind of more open. They have a bunch of regions. It's like a world, right? And your focus is all these different things. And if you have the world, you can jump around a distance and you can kind of have all these different themes within one world. I tend to focus smaller, and so consequently, the smaller it is, it's has a more thick vibe to it, and that's interesting, I think, because it lets you really play with certain themes intensively, but also it prohibits certain other themes. Like, I wasn't so much saying that where are all the fae? It's more so there are themes that are interesting and that I'd want to explore and that I think would be fun to explore that don't really fit in Ashes well, or in the world. So, as much as I love it, if I was going to, and I would want to, do another campaign, I think I would want to write it in a very different setting with a different basket of themes, a different set of like ways the world works, kind of a novel thing to explore these other options. I actually have one cooking right now.
Oh, do you?
My thought would be something based off of turn of the century, so like 1900s, and then some like fairy tale, like
A little bit of fairy tale
vibes.
steampunk in there.
Yeah, somewhere between that, but also like gothic. So that sort of energy. I do have a setting cooking actually, but I think I'd want to do something like that that has just a whole different basket of themes, a whole different set of ideas. The narratives that I had in my head 3 years ago have kind of changed as the world's changed around us. I mean, we live in a very different place than we did a few years ago, and the problems we grapple with, I feel like, are different, and I don't feel like I'd want to make a setting designed to address those, not the ones I was playing with in Ashes.
Okay, well, fair enough. Didn't mean to push you into any uncomfortable territory if I did. We can
Not at all. I hope you're not too
want
upset by that answer.
No, it's all right. I mean, as much as I would love to come back and just see how much shit out you blew up in the 300 years since we last saw her, I understand that as a DM you got to play something that's fun, and I can't wait to see what you got cooking. Taking a little bit of a step back from the grander themes, I'd love to talk about some of the meta-narrative, I guess would be the right phrase, of the campaign itself. We started in D&D 5th edition, but as people who play the campaign will know, we made a transition to Pathfinder. I think it was just after Sitek that we made the switch to Pathfinder. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? Because I know it was at the time when the narrative was opening up in a way that like the political factions became a much more important element to the campaign, and I know that you came to us and you were very upfront, and you said, look, it's the campaign's going in a way that I've already strapped on a lot of modules to D&D already, and strapping on more is not going to solve the problem. And so the solution, I think, is that we have to consider seriously making a change. And the narrative from my perspective, as I remember that discussion going, was, at least for me, I remember we discussed it a couple times, and I remember it boiled down, at least for me, to a single question, which was, if we make the switch, can the campaign happen? And you said yes, and I was like, okay, then we're doing it. We're making the switch. And we made the switch. Had some very fun one-shots in there to learn Pathfinder, but we did, and I don't regret the change at all. It's actually been very interesting. What was that narrative for you like when you made the decision to come to us and say, like, hey guys, I think we need to make this change?
Oh boy, that is the almighty can of worms, actually. Do you remember that fight that was... you guys were attacking a knoll encampment, one of the Khan's camps. You were fighting with people. There was that big fight.
Was it the one that we were because there was two examples of that. There was the one where we were retreating from the god graves, and we kind of just we screwed over a place on the way with the Ironhawks. Then that would be the Bone Dust Assault, right?
Yes, that one.
Okay, Bone Dust Assault. That's where we cleared out our the territory that would become the Fix Symphony's crafting company.
Indeed.
In the Northern Iron Mountains. I remembered it.
You did. You've got all the proper nouns. I'm impressed, actually. That fight took, I think, minimum of 3 sessions, maybe more. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, D&D is very much mechanically a game about attrition. It favors, you're supposed to have 4 to 6 combats in Adventuring Day, and so it favors these really long, protracted fights. Otherwise, they're not really a challenge, a lot of the time. So, it was fights like that, slash that cave fight, which, the one where you were playing a different character under Satek.
Oh, yeah, Yeah.
They were interesting ideas. It was just the kind of long, protracted, 5th wave of enemies, that I just didn't really enjoy. I felt like that's what I needed to get interesting combat and to
you
make
feel
things...
like that's what you had to make in order to even, challenge us? Because, rather than doing, a long 4 or 5 combats in a day, you had to put all of that into, one big assault? Is that kind of it?
You could still have 4 to 5 in a day, but still you need to do 4 or 5 in a day, so you can't just have, a fight... Because the first fight's always going to be, lopsided. You're going to have every single time there is fighting, there's a sequence of fights. And that was kind of taking away from the narrative time, and it just felt sort of grindy to me, and it was a lot of prep work.
You had to make 3 different maps to do it most of the time.
Yeah, and also the enemies were very simplistic, and I didn't really want... If you try doing that with a bunch of, bite claw attacks, or they just swing a short sword at you. So I was trying to remake all the enemies. I was remaking from scratch all the enemies, and giving them their own mechanics.
Wow.
And then sometimes it didn't work out. And then for each of you all, my other problem with D&D is there's not a lot of rules for a lot of stuff. So, if you're playing a rogue... It gives you poisoner's tools, right? And so your immediate question is, hey, DM, how can I poison someone? Or if you're craftworm, it's okay, I have smithy's tools. How am I going to craft something? There's no frame of reference at all. So my solution was to make 50-page PDFs of rules to try to cover all that. And then they wouldn't be balanced.
Pages?
That's a hyperbole, but in summarization of all of them, I think all of them together approach that. Plus, making my own stat blocks, plus making the maps, I felt like I was remaking the game system, to the point where, unironically, I was thinking about actually sitting down and just making my own game system. Because at this point, what we were doing was not really something that resembled D&D much. All of that. And then that was taking away from my ability to really work on the narrative. Pathfinder streamlined a lot of that. I still make my own enemies because I like to, but I also throw stuff out of the book at you all, and it feels fine. There's rules for all that stuff. Like Adia's whole vibe. Like, I don't have to sit here and make, a custom warlock subclass and give you all these extra abilities. You can just take it. You take a dedication,
Sorry,
and it
by the way.
fits. No, it's fine. Again, I mean, Reveries.
DM, I want custom abilities and I want to teleport. Make it work.
In D&D, that's normal. Like, that's the expectation. I was doing that with everyone. It's just like, in hindsight, it was so much, and I was trying to play game dev in 50 different ways and trying to rebalance everything. As fun as that was, and as much as I'm willing to do that, not having to do that, in addition to being a grad student, really helps.
Yeah.
And then, lastly, I do research in my day job. I do statistics a lot. And so I never liked the math behind D&D much. There's a lot of, like, if you think about it with frame of reference of Pathfinder, there's a very small, narrow window of, like, positive numbers you can have. Like, your proficiency bonus goes up at 5 and 11. And you're not really getting past 11 usually. It's a very... It goes from a +2 to a +3 to a +4. It's a very narrow window of math. It makes everything kind of tight, and it's weird because you might be really good at something, but you don't feel super good at that. I like the way Pathfinder feels like you can be really good at something. I could ramble on this for longer, actually. I'm opinionated, but I'll stop. Sorry.
No, I think it's fascinating to hear from me. It's one of the reasons I'm glad to talk to you about it, because I always interpreted the change of just like, the campaign. I mean, in the end of the day, the narrative doesn't really change. It's that, look, it was a massive undertaking. You were a grad student, and it wasn't realistic or fair to be like, I have to do all of this, so I feel like we need to make a change. No problem with that. But it's fascinating to hear that it was not just a point of the setting is expanding, you're dealing with bigger threats, D&D's not equipped to handle it. It's cool to know that it was really stuff that was already kind of becoming problems or becoming sore spots, being that it was the campaign, or that it was the combat, and that it was other little elements that kind of stacked up on top of each other. That's really cool to know, because I think especially when you talk about like the math and the statistics of it, even though I am nowhere near as smart to talk about that, I do admit that between playing D&D and Pathfinder, to kind of talk about that can of worms for a second, I think one of the ways I approach making characters, to kind of tie it up very neatly, is like, if I ever had to make a guide of like how to make good characters for role-playing games, it would be like, one of the biggest tips, and I think I talked about this with TJ, is to embrace the comedy of the character. Because sure, you can make like that uber competent assassin that's never been caught and can pick a lock with like his pinky toe or whatever. But if he's playing D&D, none of that matters if he's level 2 and he rolls a 1. He's not picking that lock. It doesn't matter how competent he is. And I've seen so many people bounce off of D&D for that reason, because the image in their head doesn't match the mechanical result. Pathfinder, I think, is a very unique system in the sense that the progression kind of slowly erodes away that level of failure, right? Like there will still be a failure for something you are good at, but because of the way the numbers work in Pathfinder, it's less dependent on a dice roll, because if you have plus 20 in a stat, which is pretty common in Pathfinder, like, it's the statistical likelihood that you fail a check is much lower. So it's cool. I remember I saw a video on it once that was like, in D&D, you start out as a level 1 adventurer and you hone your skills, and then you start as a level 1 adventurer, you swing your level 1 sword at level 5 enemy and you don't hit, fine. Then you go into adventure, you become level 10, then you go to attack that level 5 enemy again, and then you miss again. And that can be unsatisfying. In Pathfinder, you start as that level 1 enemy, you start as that level 1 farmer, you swing your level 1 sword, you miss the level 5 enemy, then you come back and you hone your skills and you fight, and then you come back and you re-enter that fight with that level 5 enemy, like, statistically more powerful. It really feels like your adventurer has grown into a hero, which I think fits very nicely with the story of the narrative that you've kind of fostered in the campaign, which is that, starting from little nobodies to becoming these grand players in the setting. I don't know if you feel the same way, but that's how I felt it. I think it plays very nicely with it.
Yeah, I feel very strongly about that. It's one of the things in D&D. It's kind of like, it's more of a dice game. There's more. It's part of the joy of D&D is, you know, seeing that natural 20 and getting a dopamine rush. It's a lot of like leaving it up to chance. It's kind of more gamble-y than Pathfinder, in which
a little bit more slot
you can
machine-y.
tactics your way out of it.
Pulling the lever.
Yeah, like you have shots and Reverie rolls a 1 and he's cursing because he doesn't crit, but he hits. You know.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you have those moments, and like when you all do like setup and you get like the minute numbers. Also, okay. Slight other tangent. I opened it back up to me, so I'm gonna talk about this more. The fact that there's more abilities in Pathfinder that makes there a larger range of things you can do. Like when you had like Vince and Reverie being this like sniping duo, or like when you have like Azale and Adia, and like Azale will like set them up and then Adia is able to crit. You know, more abilities lets you make more interesting characters and come up with these cool new things that each person can do. Not only does it make combat not boring because you're not just swing, and turn, it gives you all these new abilities, but it also lets you mix narrative and combat more to where it feels like you actually are setting each other up and playing as a team and working together, and you have this squad thing. Versus in D&D, like, I am hitting the same person that someone else is. Whoop-de-doo. You know, it's a lot harder to make it feel like a team effect. Yeah, have you felt that at all? Now I'm asking you questions. This is my podcast now. I'm taking over.
Okay. I've definitely felt, I think for me personally, it took a really long time for Pathfinder to click the right way. I was very much in the D&D brain of things. And it took a long time for me to really click with Pathfinder in the way that it needed to. And I think it only clicked really recently. I think it only clicked after the sinkhole. I think the sinkhole really cemented how I understood the benefits of the system mechanically, because it became, I was so used to just bonus action economy that I didn't really stop to think about what a 3 action economy does for you mechanically, and what it does for the enemies, more importantly, because in D&D, I think the crux of it is effectively, in D&D, movement is always free. So, like, shove actions are basically useless, assuming it's not, like, tied behind a skill check to get back up. Like, shoving someone back 5 feet doesn't matter. When their turn, they have 30 feet of movement for free, and they're just going to come back and come back on top of you and hit you again. So, the idea of positioning becomes a lot less valuable. But in Pathfinder, movement is always an action. And a lot of actions are expensive. It is an action-expensive economy. Like, doing cool things almost always costs, at a minimum, 2 actions. So if you're lucky, you get a movement and an action. But if you want to do the high-end, like, take a big chunk out of somebody, or do a serious game-changing move, it requires 3 actions, if not prep before those 3 actions. So suddenly a shove action becomes way more important. Right? Like, not only have you shoved someone, they now have to burn an action to get back in a range or to do what they want to do. And that ruins plans that way. And it also makes, it not only makes positioning more important, but it makes setup way more important. Way more than it ever felt like in D&D. In D&D, setup almost always felt like it was like narrative setup. It'd be like, okay guys, what are we gonna do? And you're like role-playing what the setup is. And then obviously it happens and there's a couple checks maybe. And Pathfinder, it really feels like the role-play translates into a mechanical setup, right? Like, you can see they have a negative for this because we did this, and so on and so forth. It's not just they have less hit points than they did before. I think Pathfinder really facilitates that feeling more. I think D&D is a much, like, for a starter, it's a much simpler system. It's really easy to get hooked into, and it's a perfect jumping off point. I'd recommend anyone who starts playing these games start with D&D. But I think Pathfinder is a very welcome change once it makes sense to you in terms of playing as a team and setup. So I definitely do feel it. And I'm just kind of going into the reasonings behind how long it took me to click with Pathfinder and why it feels so good now.
I'm glad to hear that Yeah, the setup feeling important and making more team play. And the fact that like when you have like level +1, level +2 enemies like the boss fights, you actually have to set each other up.
Yeah,
And you
exactly.
can spend like so like an entire action, where you have someone who just sets up, but like then they're missing because of that or they're wasting actions. And I don't know. I think it feels more tactical and it made the combat more enjoyable. The last ramble. I will try to stop from this becoming half the podcast. But the fact that like the way social skills work, the fact that there are rules and social skills, lore skills, the fact that like there's all this stuff for out of combat. In D&D, 95% of the rules are just combat. If you're playing a fighter and you don't have high charisma because what are you going to do in a conversation? Yeah, because you have to choose. If you're a barbarian, you have to have dex, con, and strength. There's no other option. When you're playing, and you're trying to talk, it's very easy to be, oh, okay, well, now make a persuasion check, and it's like, well, I guess I'll let the person who can talk. As a note, the person who is probably listening to this, who I'm playing our barbarian in, I want to note, I don't feel that way in your game. It's an exception. I'm having a lot of fun. I feel like I can contribute in conversations. But it's very easy for it to not feel that way, and a lot of times, and you're kind of ignoring rules in that point. It's kind of hard to, the rules don't allow it, so you're fighting them. In Pathfinder, I can run a heist, and it's not just a couple of skill checks. It feels like you all have all these extra abilities that you can use, and you can do all this cool stuff. Or like when you all were doing like a debate, I felt like that probably needed some work on my end, but like you can run those pitched social encounters. You have a wider reach, so it's not just either role play, which is mostly devoid from mechanics, or combat, which is all mechanics and mostly devoid from role play. It lets you have a lot of gray area in between, which I'm still learning to make the most of.
No, I think that's really cool. Yeah, I agree with you. So, we're going to take a little bit of step back from the Pathfinder talk, although it has been a really interesting conversation because I have wanted to talk about it for a really long time. It's just hasn't come up. A little bit back towards campaign. We're going to do a little bit more fun questions here, a little bit more, less grand narrative focused. Favorite NPC of the campaign thus far? That you get to play all of them, so you really have the best guess here. Who's been the most fun to play?
I knew this one was going to come up too, and yet another question you're not going to like the answer to. In my own personal opinion, I'm god-awful with NPCs. I don't think I've ever played with a DM who doesn't do them significantly better than me. It's just one of my weak spots. There are like 2 NPCs with names who we think of at all. You probably know who those 2 are.
Our child and Angel.
Yes, that's it. Part of that is because when you have a large group, and we have 6 people, which is a large group, I don't think you want a lot of heavy NPCs, because any conversation that's player NPC could have been player, and when there's 6 people, I want to get people talking as much as possible. I already do enough of talking at all points, so the less NPCs are relevant, the more you all are relevant, the more you all are dealing with each other, the better the narrative feels, and the less likely we are to have someone who says 4 words, because I don't know, Schmergle the gnome was talking for half the campaign.
No, you're not a big Boblin the Goblin guy.
Yeah, I like them, but just not for groups this large. And also, I'm bad at them, so I specifically make my groups this large, so you don't feel like I'm bad at them. But the answer is Pasha.
You say the answer's Pasha. You just say that because he created an underground criminal empire when we weren't looking.
I just like his voice.
Okay. Well, I mean, credit to you for acknowledging that you're like, I have this weakness, I don't enjoy it as much as I maybe do other people. But, I mean, you created 2 NPCs that the party loves, in and out of character. So, I mean, good, sure, self-aware is great, but just, credit to you where it's due, man. You managed to lock it in ways that felt really good. And, I always liked Vasilios. I think Vasilios was kind of a fun, just in narrative. Vasilios was I think Vasilios is probably going to be my favorite NPC. Just because he was a character that, I don't know if he did this on purpose, but he surprised me. Genuinely surprised me. It made him feel really real. At first, we kind of just press-ganged him out of guilt. to start working for us because his boss almost got us killed in like session 5. And we kind of just had him hanging around and dragged him around wherever we pleased for forever. Like, I remember it was a running joke that he was scared of Adia. And Adia just kept making him do shit because of it. Like, she kept stealing his money, even though he was very well paid. Like, imagine being paid $1 million and your boss takes half of it. You're still $500,000, okay? Easy. But then we got to Satek. And when it was like the party split and Adia was on the home team and Vasilio's... And Adia was on the home team, and she was just trying to hold everything together, and she was really stuck and stagnant. It was Vasilios, of all people, that snuck back into the city and was like, hey, we got a problem. And she was like, I don't know what to do with it. And she got mired down in this bureaucracy of not wanting to risk it. And then of all people, like, up to this point, she saw Vasilios just like a good person, but ultimately kind of funny and somewhat cowardly. But then of all people, Vasilios was like, I'm gonna go. I have to go get him. I have to go get our people. And and that was a moment both in and out of character was like, oh, he's not just a coward. He's more than that. He's a thing. He has personalities where, like, when push comes to shove, when the cards are down, he shows up. And I think Adia and I had way more respect for him after that, and he became a much more interesting character. I don't know if it came across, but Adia became much more personable to him. I think it was right after that arc, I just started writing, probably kind of spoilers for me, but I just started writing her letters to him. Like, she only showed it to him. It became a very fun, like, intimate, as friendships go, relationship between the two of them. And when, obviously the blowout happened after the Molten Lord, it was Vasilios that came, because they had different relationships in many ways. So, I mean, I don't know if you meant to do that or not. I don't know what was and wasn't intentional. Who knows what goes beyond the DM screen. But I love Vasilios for those reasons. So I just wanted to gush a little bit about that.
Well, once again, 2 notes. The first being that the way I approach character creation, NPC creation, I should say, is I make them as plot devices, to be brutally honest. Like, they tend to be somewhat one-dimensional because I put a lot of focus on the characters, and I more so think, what's their place in the world, but also how are they going to interact? What interactions are they going to have? First, I don't really get, like, locked in or focus on them much. So actually, it ends up being the antagonists that I flesh out the most, because they're the ones who are going to interact with you all the most. Mm-hmm. But second bit, just a bit of Vasilios lore. As you all may note, he was raised in the heavens. He was, like, up amongst the Celestials, and his patron god was the icon of bravery, actually.
Oh, shit.
So,
okay.
For a lot of his, like, kind of earliness, he was grappling with the fact of, like, I am supposed to be, like, this icon of bravery, but I'm not. And, like, it was a lot of that, like, I don't know what to do. So he was kind of following you all around because you all intimidated him, but also because you all were strong, and he kind of wanted to resonate with that. But it was kind of a joke at first that, like, oh, this guy who's cowardly has the icon of bravery. It's kind of funny. And then in that same moment that you mentioned, that's kind of when I think it clicked for him as a character, and I kind of thought that, like, this is when he buckles down and everything kind of makes sense, and he's like, well, I don't have to be strong to be brave, was his realization. Like, I don't have to live, I just have to go try. And once he hit that kind of, he got a lot less afraid of you.
But that's so cool. That's so cool how that kind of, like, I didn't know that he was the icon of bravery, but, like, even without, like, knowing that, and without, like, having that written knowledge, it was still something that could be sensed implicitly. I was like, he was a little bit of a coward, but he showed up, and despite it all, and he's learned about himself. So I still think that, I've still had an incredible time with your NPCs, even if I do probably annoy the shit out of you asking for names every other session.
You don't. Honestly, that's a joke. It makes me stall slightly, but I've started, first off, outsourcing it to you all. I just make a table first, and then second off, I have a few like prepped, so if I need a random name, I like already have rolled on it a few times. I've gotten good at that. Honestly, the thing about NPCs is because I make them kind of flat. I can make a new one very easily. Like they just kind of spontaneously exist.
They're quick and easy.
Yeah, quick and easy. The NPCs I enjoy making the most are the ones who you will hate. It's really funny to make a guy who just like is very punchable and is going to get killed.
I will say you've set up some absolute bastards. I think this will cue into the next question I have, and it'll be the last couple. We got a few more questions to ask. This is a big one. Who has been your favorite villain to create thus far? Or I'll double phrase it for you because there's kind of two questions I want to have answered here if I can get them. A, who have you had the most fun creating as a villain NPC? And who are you most excited for us to eventually interact with and see? Like, can you answer that, or is this a banana question? Because I'd really like to know.
So the first question, I don't know. I have had campaigns in the past, and no one who listens to this is going to be the person I'm talking about if you've DM'd for me. This was in my home game that you all know I do sometimes. But it was someone who's like super strong and kind of unkillable, and they're kind of just like there, and they hover and you fight them, and then like you die, and it's like, well, what are we doing? And then like I like making antagonists that are strong, sure, but like they're kind of just assholes, and you can kill them. You know, like sometimes it's kind of cathartic to have someone who's a jerk and who you can get you can swindle them, you can like kind of annoy them. In terms of antagonists, I really liked the Minotaur that you all killed very quickly, who robbed Craftworm.
Sorry.
He did like no, this is good. I make them to die. I make every single antagonist to die. There's not a single one that I am like invested in and I want to survive. If you kill them, you kill them. It's all good for me. But there's the Minotaur who, I think what he did is he challenged Craftworm to a coin toss, right, for his stuff. And he said like, okay, heads I win, tails you win. So like Craftworm gambled like some of his like expensive ore, and the other guy put up money and he flipped the coin.
And that's
the guy
right,
lost.
Craftworm won. Let's remember that.
Yeah, Craftworm won, and the guy was like, shame, tails you lose. You better like, I'm taking your stuff. And Craftworm was just like, oh, so you're dead. And that was just very fun. I like making antagonists who are just kind of the worst. Like the guy who is like, I'm never gonna get to do this, so I'll just tell you. If Craftworm hadn't like body checked the guy who was going to your fruit cart last time, he had this whole thing where he was like, oh, I heard mangoes bounced. And so he's gonna start taking them and just slapping them onto the ground and be like, damn, guess this one's defective. Slap, damn, guess this one's defective. Yeah, it's kind of funny to just be kind of mean, especially because it's all in good fun. Y'all get to kill them anyway. Yeah. But y'all can also, I also enjoy antagonists who you all kind of just completely outplay, like Hiram, who you guys just kind of kicked his ass. There wasn't really much of a contest. Or people who you all just like kind of go around and like the other Nolan Cameron that you mentioned earlier, where you all just robbed him and didn't even fight him. Like I love stuff like that. I think it's funny to have different ways of interacting with different antagonists.
So would you say that for the second half of the question, is there any antagonists you're looking forward to?
There's some good ones. I'm of the opinion that my antagonists are good, so obviously I'm excited for most of them. That damn fruit merchant. I'm excited to see where you all go with that. I didn't know he was going to be a major antagonist, but I'm very happy he is. I've written stuff in. I also don't know who you're going to fight and who you're not. The leader of the gang you all might get to a confrontation with. He's kind of a jerk. So
okay.
There's a few others, but you don't know if they're antagonists or not yet. Then there's some people who you all might side with or might fight against. Yeah, sorry, a lot of them are spoilers. For now, it's the fruit merchant I'm excited about.
Okay. A few more questions here. Let's talk. How do I? I'm looking at my notes here and I'm failing to read them. Okay, there it is. Favorite campaign moment thus far? What was the moment you really sat back after session and was like, that was good? I liked that. Do you have a favorite moment you can point to?
That's hard. To be completely honest,
You can give me several.
I will. Don't worry. As a person who is just sitting back and watching with popcorn, my favorite moments are the ones where you guys just like fucking kick ass. Like the moment of no, you should be running, and the enemy's like, oh god, these guys are fucking wild. I love those moments. So like, a lot of those, ironically, it's not really the pitched battles. I do like the pitched battles, but like those moments of like the exact moment they realize they messed up and like the characters get this big heroic like badass moment. I don't know. I'm always a sucker for that kind of stuff. And then second, kind of deeper character moments. So like for Adia, for example, I don't know. I really liked I think getting that letter, I felt really great sending you that. I felt terrible.
You're a real bastard. It was a good letter in the worst ways.
Yeah, kind of getting those moments, not so much because it kind of pushes the character down, but mostly just, again, like, it's the moments of triumph that I find the most interesting. So it's when you realize, oh, I'm going to move past this or move on, that personally, like, those growth moments are kind of what I'm here for. And I think a lot of those, we've had a lot of those, but a lot of those are to come as well.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of, especially this current arc, it's going to see a lot of, you've got like 3 different super relevant character threads all in one arc, right? You have Ozlai's mom, you have Zamir, whatever's going on with him, and then you have Adia's brother. And then I think those 3 narrative threads are probably, I'm guessing as a player, will be intertwined in some ways. So I'm pretty sure there will be some very fascinating character moments to come. Not to mention, we're eventually going to take Vince to go fight the Khan. God knows how that's going to go, and it's another thing to look forward to. But I definitely think this coming arc is going to be a bit of a big one. I don't think we'll be leaving this place the same, if I can not jinx it.
This might be a slight spoiler, but to give you a broad stroke, I anticipate the events in this city will be the bulk of the remainder of the campaign.
Really?
Try to figure out what that means. But this city, part of the reason I kind of wanted to explain that you all shouldn't feel the need to rush is going to be most of the rest of the plot. There's stuff after, but like this is going to be most of it.
This is going to be some meat and potatoes.
Yes.
Ooh boy.
I think generally after this we're at like falling action. You're geographically in the place of the climax, so be prepared.
This is why I wanted to have this episode. I wanted to know things I shouldn't know. Ooh, that's really cool to know. Okay, I got one more question for you, and then I think we will wrap up there. I've been asking people, especially that are in this campaign, to try to summarize what they think the campaign is about. And I've challenged them to do it in like 4 words or less. So I'm not gonna ask. I might ask you to do the same thing. But one of the interesting answers I got, and it's from Jared, talking about Zamir, is he said, if I remember him correctly, it feels like a world where the gods are no longer there. Or not no longer there, but that they're absent, right? It feels really, like, it has this vibe of like the gods may have been hands-on at one point, but they have since pulled back in a way. And I don't know if that's a factor of them being elemental in nature, or if that's just like they physically pulled back. Because, you know, a lot of the times when characters try to communicate with gods, they don't get direct answers. They get feelings, they get vibes. At least up until Zamir, when he actually walked through the land of the river, the ocean of the dead, he actually spoke to a god. It's the first time in the entire campaign I know of that a god actually directly spoke to another character. And that was really interesting insight. I thought that was a really cool insight. I would be curious to hear if you had to, you know, put it in 4 words or less, or if not, go off as long as you want to. What is the campaign at this point about?
Well, do you want me to give you my 4 words, or do you want me to kind of explain the god thing?
Give me both.
Or should I do both? Okay. 4 words, thinking heavily about this. I think fuck around, find out is my 4 words for the campaign.
True. A lot of fucking around and finding out.
Yeah, that's my summary. As for the gods thing, the 6 elemental gods were always distant, somewhat no, they weren't absent. They're just not people. I thought it was interesting to make gods that are less like your like proper Greek pantheon and more like the Titans, you know, that came before. These like raw elemental forces that aren't all good. They're kind of just abstract beings, and they can be appeased, and, you know, sometimes they're helping you, but other times, you know, like they require sacrifices. It's this kind of neutral older gods.
Yeah, much more like elemental, right? Less, I think I said it earlier, less of a conscious god, if that makes sense. More the embodiment of something.
Yeah, and so you have the kind of gods underneath those, like the humanoid souls that have ascended or descended to become like a demon or a celestial or whatever. And those are the ones you can talk to, the ones that Mir talk to, the ones that are around. And in most settings, I think you'd have those gods be the focus, and like the elemental gods would be this kind of like abstract, weird side thing. But part of what I wanted from this campaign was to set it in the weird, abstract side place where they worship that stuff. You know, like as much as other regions might worship their refined gods, this campaign is set in a place where they worship the old ones. And I just thought it was interesting because it's very different from the way a lot of settings are, and it kind of creates these alternate characters where, you know, your perspective on the world is kind of different, because you can't look at those other gods without saying, oh, but those are somewhat lesser beings. But then also these great beings they're not as predictable, and they're not as nice, you know, like they're not evil, they're just not, niceness is not really a thing in their wheelhouse.
Like they're more nature-esque, right? Like an animal or a predator isn't evil inherently, it's just doing what it does, right? It's not evil or uneval when it kills something, it's just, that's what it does. That's much more the vibe I get from your pantheon.
Is that, to kind of, again, take over your podcast, how does that feel to play it? Like, is it compelling? Is it, like, completely fine if the answer is, it's kind of weird, and, like, I'm not sure I'd want to do it again? Like, how does it feel, and how difficult is it of a headspace to get into?
It's not... It's weird in like really, really good ways that I wouldn't have expected to enjoy as much as I do, because you talked about like changing as people and wanting to tell different stories over like the past 3 years or so. When I started playing in this campaign, I'd only ever been in one other campaign, and I'd like to think I not only matured as a person, but I matured as a player. And one of the things I really wanted out of a character was, and you might remember this from TJ's campaign we were doing Among the Banners, is I had a character who was constantly in communication with a god for some reason. Like they were constantly had this internal conflict they were suffering, right? There was always a sort of inward conflict to their outward one. I really wanted to do that. And I loved doing it in TJ's with Renaud Denor. But obviously that campaign ended, and then it ended just after this one started, so I still very much had that desire when I made this character to be in a communication with a higher being, because I found that narrative really compelling. Most of the time, and from what I've seen as I have watched more and played more, is that characters who are related to gods, their communication is much less, it's not as straightforward as you're picking up a phone and you're calling a guy every once in a while and you get an answer back. Like, most of the time, the gods don't answer you. They give you sort of feelings about it. And when it's a D&D type god, or it's a celestial type god, where they are actual, like, sentient beings, or they're pitched as such, that their non-responsiveness can often feel personal. It can be like they're just not picking up the phone. I know they can pick up the phone, but they're not. You know, maybe they have some other godly reason why they're not picking up the phone, but they're ducking me, right? And that can play into a character of, like, why isn't this god answering me? Conversely, in this campaign, you still get that sort of God isn't picking up the phone vibe, but rather than feeling like it's inherently personal, like it's inherently them ducking your calls, it's more like that's just not how they talk. Like, that's not how they communicate. They may not respond to you, but it's not so personal. It's not like they're actively ducking your calls. It's just like, they are not a deity. They are a force of something, right? You couldn't so much as harness the wind in a jar to talk to you, right? Like, it doesn't work that way. It makes sense that they didn't respond to you, and when they do respond to you, it makes sense that they don't speak to you naturally. Like, they give you vibes, they give you impression. It is such a unique way of kind of communing with a force that is supposed to be so beyond you. And in many ways, because of that beyondness, I think it allows both the player and the DM to kind of, while not interacting as straightforward as it would be if a god spoke to you, but interact more, have more volume, right? Because it's very easy as a DM or a player to be like, I get this impression from somebody. The DM doesn't have to whip up some elaborate explanation of why the god is doing what they do, and they now have to spell it out for you mere mortals. Like, it's like the communication is different. It doesn't feel as personal when they don't, and it can facilitate a different kind of interaction with more of it. I think that is what I would say, and I've really enjoyed it. I think over the course of the campaign, Adia stopped, or I tried to stop, being as direct with the Skyfather as she started out. She started out in the beginning, and this is a character thing, actually. It's a fun little bit. When she was given power from the Skyfather, she kind of was like, okay, the Skyfather is now my role model. I will follow him for what he did for me. Like, I'm beholden to him. I will enact his vengeance, not just because I have power, but because he gave it to me. There was a loyalty there. And she started the campaign out very much like, hey, tell me what to do. Like, just let me at him, boss. But he kept being like, no, that's not what I'm doing. It's yours now. Like, I can't tell you what to do with it. And as the campaign has progressed, she has matured, and I have matured as a player to be like less direct asking for direction, but more just like feeling, more getting those vibes and reacting to them. So, yeah, all of that condensed in. I have liked it a lot. It's been a different way of doing it.
Part of my goal with making the gods that way was that sort of aspect was deliberate. I think it's really cool to have like a world where like the gods are there and present, but kind of a bit of my outlook on reality pushing in. Like, at the end of the day, it's also interesting, in my opinion, to have a world where like people are kind of it, you know, like you have to deal with it. There are these forces, but like they're not going to show up and save the day. The skill or the power ceiling might be these incredibly powerful people, but they're all people. You know, it's a lich that was a person, or you know, a celestial that in my setting was a person, or elves that are just people with special sauce. You have this like high levels of power, but they're all sort of obtainable. And at the end of the day, they can all be killed. You know, if you ram a sword hard enough through them, they're gonna die. And having that kind of lack of easy answers and that lack of beings that are kind of tipping the scales, and it really just being somewhere between a beautiful place for plucky individualism and kind of horrifically Mad Max without anyone to really, call the shots or enforce any sorts of rules. You get a more person-centered setting, which is what I wanted to explore with Ashes. So I hope you're enjoying that.
No, I've enjoyed it very much. I know I said last question was the last question, but there's one very important question I feel I need to end every podcast off with. So we'll end it.
I need to beat Jared.
End it here. Yeah, I think you beat him. So congratulations. Why do you do this? Why do you love Dungeons and Dragons, or not Dungeons and Dragons? Why do you love this thing, this hobby that we dedicate hours of our life to every week? Why do you love it? What makes this hobby so amazing to you?
Well, there's a number of overlapping pull features. First off, I don't get to be very creative in my day-to-day life, unless you count making graphs, creativity, which I don't. Not a lot of room for creative outlet. So D&D gives me a chance to write and tell stories and, work in that way, which is very, keeps me able to get some sort of expression.
Yeah.
Second off, I really enjoy hanging out with you cool people, and it's can be difficult to find an excuse to talk to people, the modern post-pandemic world being what it is.
Yeah.
So being able to have a group of friends with whom I meet at a regular basis is quite astounding. And then lastly, game design interests me. It's never a path I could go down, but I get to get some of that out here as well. So,
well, there you go. I don't think you could put up a better answer than that. That was pretty good. Well, Yvette, I want to say thank you so much for coming on. I know when I dropped the first episode of this, it was a very random idea. It's just like, oh, what is this freak over here doing with his recording shit? What is he doing? I know it was something unexpected, but I really appreciate everyone who's participated thus far. I'm glad you've enjoyed it, and I'm really glad that everyone kind of took this chance with me to do this fun thing. And I'm really glad that you chose to take a chance as well. Let me pick your brain a little bit. And I want to say thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much for facilitating this hobby that we do. I mean, straight up, man, if you weren't here, this shit wouldn't happen. And it's been, I've been incredibly happy and lucky. I feel very lucky that I got a chance to do it with you fine people and with you as the DM. And I'm just very glad that I not only got to do that, but I got to do this as well. So just thank you so much for coming on, and thank you so much for being our DM, sir.
Well, thank you much for joining me, both weekly and here. To be completely honest, I could talk additionally for another time slot, so...
Maybe we'll do a part two.
We could do a part two. But really, thank you for doing these. As the person who's campaigned, at least in some of them, you've now spoiled that TJ is going to be episode 3. I don't think I didn't catch that. Which, for everyone listening, that has already came out, but for me, it's a spoiler that I will not tell you. I don't know. It's very interesting to see, and honestly, I'm kind of amazed that anyone cares enough to make a podcast and talk at all about this weird thing that I've made and scribbled on a notepad in Panera. Is now getting talked about.
Really?
The campaign setting was in Jordan, but some of the antagonists you fought. Hiram was a note I was doing economics homework in Panera, and then I was scribbling on the notes and evil cowboy robot ?
Yeah, evil cowboy robots, man. Keep them coming. Well, I guess that's about it. Thank you everyone so much for watching. Again, thank you, Fen, for coming on. I can't wait to make another. They say that 50% of podcasts out there don't get past 3 episodes. So what do you know? We're in the top 50. Thank you for helping me get it there. And thank you to everyone who's watching or listening. Not much to watch yet, but we'll get there someday. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And I hope you have a wonderful next session. Woo!